Early morning mist hangs over the city streets, mixing with coal smoke drifting from chimneys and factory stacks. Horse carts rattle over damp cobblestones. Tram bells clang in the distance. Along the River Liffey, workers move through the cool air with collars pulled tight against the wind coming in from Dublin Bay. And rising above it all, one smell dominates parts of the city. The rich scent of roasted barley and brewing hops drifting from the enormous Guinness brewery at St James's Gate. A smell that settled into clothes and seemed to linger in the streets themselves. This was a city balanced between old and new. British rule still stretched across Ireland, but the political mood was shifting. Conversations in pubs had begun to change. Home rule was being argued over at street corners and dinner tables. National identity, independence and Ireland's future sat quietly in the background of everyday life. Not every family discussed politics openly, but people could feel something changing. Into this uncertain world, on the 22nd of March 1912, Henry Wilfred Brambell was born in Dublin. He was the youngest of three boys, the late arrival in a busy household. His father, Henry Lytton Brambell, worked as a cashier at Guinness Brewery, a respectable and steady position in one of Dublin's largest employers. It meant routine, stability, long working days, a life measured by clocks and ledgers. His mother Edith brought something rather different into the house. Before marriage, she had been an opera singer, and perhaps that changed the atmosphere at home. You can almost imagine it, music drifting from another room, songs sung while carrying out household chores, stories told around the table, small performances, laughter arriving unexpectedly. One parent tied to order and routine, the other carrying traces of theatre and performance. Perhaps young Wilfred inherited something from both. Outside the family home, Ireland itself was changing rapidly. When Wilfred was still a child, Europe fell into the catastrophe of the First World War. Although Ireland was distant from the trenches of France and Belgium, the war touched homes everywhere, and it was during this time that young Wilfred had his first taste of performing. As a child, he entertained wounded soldiers. It's a small detail in his story, but an important one. Picture the scene. Rows of injured men, some exhausted, some homesick, some carrying wounds nobody could see. And somewhere among them, a young boy trying to make people smile, trying to lift a room, trying to make pain disappear, if only briefly. Maybe he discovered something then. That performance could change how people felt. That laughter could carry weight. As he grew older, Wilfred followed a less direct route toward acting than many might expect. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden leap toward the stage. Instead, he worked part-time as a reporter for the Irish Times, while continuing to act whenever opportunities appeared. One world dealt in facts, the other in imagination. And for a while, he lived in both. Soon Dublin's theatre world began pulling him in. The city had become a lively centre of Irish drama and performance. New ideas and new voices were appearing on stages across Ireland. Wilfred first found work at the Abbey Theatre before moving toward the Gate Theatre, where he began taking acting more seriously. Slowly, almost without noticing, the balance of his life shifted. Journalism had paid the bills, but acting had started to feel like home, and what had once seemed a side road was quietly becoming the road itself. By the time Wilfred Brambell left Dublin behind, Europe was moving toward another period of uncertainty. The years ahead would not bring instant success. There would be no grand arrival, no overnight breakthrough, no bright theatre marquees announcing a new star. Instead, there were train stations, endless train stations, steam hissing along platforms, porters pushing luggage trolleys through clouds of smoke, suitcases worn at the edges, small dressing rooms, temporary lodgings, rain against carriage windows somewhere between one unfamiliar town and the next. For actors of Wilfred's generation, life could become nomadic. And so it did. He moved through repertory theatre companies in places like Swansea, Bristol and Chesterfield. The rhythm of repertory life was relentless. New productions appeared constantly. Actors learned scripts quickly and moved on even faster. 1 week comedy, the next tragedy, then Shakespeare, then perhaps a detective story. There was little glamour in it, just hard work, days blurred into rehearsals and train journeys. Cheap digs, new faces, new accents, the same suitcases being unpacked and packed again. But hidden inside that routine was an education impossible to find elsewhere. Night after night, performance after performance, Wilfred was learning his craft, learning timing, learning audiences, learning people. Then, once again, history interrupted ordinary lives. War returned to Europe. When the Second World War broke out, Britain changed almost overnight. Cities darkened beneath blackout curtains. Families waited anxiously for letters. Railway stations filled with soldiers leaving home. And Wilfred found himself joining ENSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association. Known by some soldiers as Every Night Something Awful, ENSA performers travelled across Britain and beyond, entertaining military personnel wherever they could. But behind the jokes was important work, because entertainment mattered, perhaps more than people realised. Picture the scene: drafty halls, temporary stages, rows of exhausted servicemen sitting with mugs of tea, men uncertain whether they would soon be sent overseas. And onto the stage walks Wilfred Brambell, trying once again to make people forget their worries for an hour, trying once again to lift a room. Years earlier he had entertained wounded soldiers as a child. Now he was doing something strangely similar as a grown man. After the war, Britain itself looked exhausted. Cities carried scars. Streets had changed. Families had changed. Television, however, was beginning to open new doors. Wilfred found work where he could. Small television appearances, small film appearances, a drunk here, a tramp there, an ageing man sitting quietly in the corner of a pub. There was something unusual about him. Though still relatively young, casting directors repeatedly looked at Wilfred and saw age. Not youth, not romance, not heroic leading men, old men, weathered men, broken men. And so, while still only in his 40s, he began building a reputation for playing characters many years older than himself. At the time, it probably felt limiting. Another odd role, another small appearance, another character actor's life. But without realising it, Wilfred was quietly moving toward the role that would define him forever. Away from the cameras and theatre lights, meanwhile, life seemed to promise something else, something steadier. In 1948 he married Mary Josephine Hall, known simply as Molly. Perhaps marriage felt like an anchor after years of travelling, after years spent moving from theatre to theatre. A home, a routine, a family, the ordinary things so many people hoped for after surviving wartime. For a while perhaps it looked possible, but life has a way of rewriting stories people think they understand. The marriage slowly began to fracture, and then came a devastating revelation. Molly gave birth to a child, but the child was not Wilfred's. It was later revealed that the father had been a lodger. Even decades later, the detail lands with an almost uncomfortable heaviness, because beneath all the public performances and stage roles sat a very private betrayal. The marriage ended. By 1955, the couple had divorced. And afterward, there seems to be a sense of increasing loneliness drifting through parts of Wilfred Brambell's story. The actor who could fill theatres and entertain audiences suddenly seemed to be carrying burdens no audience could see. Away from the stage lights, Brambell's personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. By the early 1960s, Britain itself seemed to be changing speed. The grey years of post-war rationing and rebuilding were slowly beginning to fade. New fashions appeared in shop windows, coffee bars filled with teenagers, television sets flickered in living rooms across the country, becoming the centrepiece of family life. Britain was beginning to feel younger, but Wilfred Brambell was still making a living playing old men. By now he had spent years building a career from small appearances and supporting roles. The familiar rhythm continued. Turn up, perform, disappear. Reliable work certainly, but hardly stardom. And then, in 1962, a door quietly opened. The BBC was developing a new sitcom pilot for its Comedy Playhouse series. On paper it hardly sounded revolutionary. A father and son. A yard full of scrap. Two men trapped together by routine. Resentment and familiarity. No glamorous settings, no grand adventures. Just arguments, disappointment and everyday life. Yet hidden inside it was something special. And for one role in particular, the producers needed someone very specific. Someone who could convincingly disappear into old age. Someone with a face audiences would instantly believe. And once again, Wilfred Brambell's unusual gift returned. Because although he was only 49 years old, he already looked older, much older. What had once seemed a limitation suddenly became his greatest advantage. Brambell was cast as Albert Steptoe, an irritable, stubborn, rag-and-bone man, supposedly in his 60s, a man with dirty fingernails, battered clothes, and questionable hygiene, a man permanently surrounded by old furniture, junk and disappointment. Alongside him stood actor Harry H. Corbett, playing Albert's frustrated son Harold. And in one of television's great ironies, Harry H. Corbett was only 13 years younger than Brambell. On screen, however, audiences believed every second. The chemistry worked immediately. Father and son did not simply argue, they collided. Small conversations became battles. Ordinary moments became emotional wars. Beneath the comedy sat something surprisingly sad. Two men unable to escape each other. And Britain loved it. The pilot succeeded. Then came a full series, then another, then another. Soon Steptoe and Son became one of the biggest television programmes in Britain. People quoted lines at work. Families gathered around televisions. The country fell in love with Albert Steptoe, and one phrase in particular followed Wilfred everywhere. Dirty old man. Harold shouted it repeatedly throughout the series. The insult became inseparable from the character, and eventually inseparable from Brambell himself. The success spread quickly. Films followed. Stage productions followed. National fame arrived. For a man who had spent years drifting between temporary theatre jobs and supporting roles, life had changed completely. But there was one strange complication. The real Wilfred Brambell was nothing like Albert Steptoe. Off-screen he dressed sharply. Friends described him as neat, polite and elegant. He spoke with refined precision. No rag and bone yard, no dirt, no cockney grumbling, no pickled onions in the bathwater. Albert Steptoe had become one of Britain's most recognisable faces. But Albert wasn't Wilfred. Not really. Still, audiences rarely separate actors from the people they play. And as the years passed, the line between the two men slowly began to blur. The role had made him famous, but it would also become almost impossible to escape. By 1964, Britain had changed dramatically from the country Wilfred Brambell had entered as a young actor years earlier. A new energy seemed to be running through the country. London in particular had begun transforming into something exciting and unpredictable. Fashion was changing, music was changing, youth culture suddenly seemed to sit at the centre of everything. And standing at the very heart of that cultural explosion were four young men from Liverpool, the Beatles. At the time, Beatlemania had become something difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't lived through it. Crowds gathered outside hotels for hours. Police struggled to control fans. Airports became scenes of screaming chaos. Wherever they travelled, hysteria followed, And somehow, right in the middle of this worldwide phenomenon, stood Wilfred Brambell. Following the enormous success of Steptoe and Son, Brambell had become one of the most recognisable faces on British television. Producers knew audiences liked him. More importantly, audiences remembered him. So when the Beatles began work on their first feature film, A Hard Day's Night, Brambell found himself cast in a role that would introduce him to viewers far beyond Britain. In the film, he played Paul McCartney's grandfather, a mischievous, charming troublemaker whose innocent appearance disguised a talent for causing chaos almost wherever he went. The role suited Brambell beautifully. There was warmth in the character, but also mischief. Gentleness mixed with unpredictability. Unlike Albert Steptoe, who often seemed trapped beneath layers of bitterness and disappointment, this character felt lighter somehow, almost playful. And there was another joke hidden in the casting. Throughout Steptoe and Son, audiences had grown used to hearing Albert insulted as a dirty old man. It had become one of the programme's most famous running gags and one of television's most repeated catchphrases. But in A Hard Day's Night, the joke was cleverly turned upside down. Again and again, characters insisted Brambell's grandfather was a very clean old man. For audiences already familiar with Steptoe, the joke landed perfectly. Because in reality, of course, Wilfred Brambell had always been far closer to this new character than to Albert Steptoe. Away from the cameras, he was known as someone who dressed carefully and spoke with elegance. Friends described him as refined and particular about his appearance. The untidy rag-and-bone man had always been a performance. Now audiences had a chance to glimpse something different, and with the Beatles' extraordinary popularity stretching far beyond Britain, Brambell suddenly found himself recognised internationally. For an actor who had spent decades working theatre stages, touring repertory companies, and appearing in small television roles, it must have felt like a remarkable transformation. Yet success rarely arrives in a neat, straightforward line. Actors often discover that fame opens some doors while quietly closing others. Although Steptoe and Son had brought Brambell enormous recognition, it had also tied him tightly to Albert Steptoe. Audiences loved him, but they loved him as Albert. And perhaps Wilfred himself had begun to feel that weight. In 1965, he told the BBC that he did not want to continue with another series of Steptoe and Son. Whether it was exhaustion, frustration, or a desire to prove he could do more, there was a sense that he wanted to move beyond the scrapyard and escape the character that had come to define him. Later that year, he travelled to New York to appear in the Broadway musical Kelly. Broadway represented something different, a new audience, a fresh beginning, a chance perhaps to step outside Albert Steptoe's long shadow. But the dream collapsed almost immediately. The production closed after a single performance. One night, one curtain call, and then it was over. For performers, there are few experiences more brutal. Theatre can be wonderfully generous, but it can also be extraordinarily unforgiving. Brambell continued working, of course. He returned to stage and television projects and remained a familiar face to audiences throughout the years that followed. But there is a sense during this period of a man still searching for something just beyond reach, a role, perhaps, or a chance to be seen as more than the old man audiences already thought they knew. Because fame had finally arrived. But fame, as Wilfred Brambell was beginning to discover, did not always bring happiness. For actors who become deeply connected to one role, success can sometimes arrive with a hidden cost. Audiences see a character and begin to believe they know the person behind it. The face becomes familiar. The catchphrases become permanent. Eventually, the performance and the performer can begin to merge in the public imagination. For Wilfred Brambell, Albert Steptoe had brought fame, recognition and financial security. But Albert had also become a shadow that followed him everywhere. By the mid-1970s, Steptoe and Son had finally come to an end, after years of extraordinary success. Britain itself was changing again. The optimistic energy of the 60s had softened into something more uncertain. New sitcoms were arriving. New faces appeared on television screens. Comedy moved on, as it always does. But for Wilfred, moving on proved harder. He continued to work steadily through the years that followed, appearing on television, in films and on stage. He and Harry H. Corbett even reunited for tours and performances, taking Steptoe to audiences in Australia and New Zealand. Reports later suggested periods of strain between the two actors, stories that would grow with time, although those who knew them often disputed tales of deep hostility. Like many long partnerships, theirs seemed more complicated than simple friendship or dislike. And perhaps that made sense. After all, the two men had spent years living beside characters that had transformed both their lives. Meanwhile, Wilfred continued searching for roles that offered something different, something beyond Albert. In 1982, he appeared in Death and Transfiguration, a short film by director Terence Davies. It was a quiet, moving performance in which Brambell played an elderly man approaching the end of his life and finally confronting long-buried truths. Remarkably, he barely spoke at all. For nearly 24 minutes, much of the performance rested not on dialogue, but expression, silence, presence. Critics praised it, and perhaps there was something fitting in that. After decades spent hidden beneath costumes, accents and comic performances, some believed they were finally seeing Wilfred Brambell the actor again. Yet outside the work itself, life seemed increasingly quieter. As the years passed, stories and rumours about his private life often followed him. Some belonged to changing attitudes of the time. Some reflected the pressures of living under public attention. Some were simply the uncomfortable price paid by public figures whose private lives become subjects of curiosity. But beneath all of it, there remains a sense of a man who spent much of his life performing, while keeping large parts of himself hidden away. Then, in early 1985, the story reached its final chapter. Wilfred Brambell had been suffering from cancer at his home in Westminster, London. On the 18th of January, at the age of 72, he died. And then came one final detail, small, quiet, and somehow deeply moving. At his funeral, only 6 people attended. Just 6. His brother, his partner Raymond, writers Ray Galton and Alan Simpson, a BBC representative, and Maureen Corbett, the widow of Harry H. Corbett. For a man whose face had once been recognised by millions, whose voice had entered living rooms across Britain week after week, it feels like a strangely intimate ending. But perhaps numbers can sometimes tell only part of a story. Because long after the funeral guests had gone home, Wilfred Brambell remained, on television screens, in repeated episodes, in catchphrases remembered decades later. And in one of Britain's most beloved sitcoms, millions remembered Albert Steptoe. But behind the famous television character stood Wilfred Brambell, an actor from Dublin who spent much of his life disappearing into other people, while quietly keeping parts of himself hidden from view. And perhaps that is the strange bargain of acting. The more completely audiences believe the character, the harder it can become to see the person underneath.